The endless Atlantic stretched in every direction, waves lapping under a vast December sky. On December 5, 1872, a small ship, bound for Gibraltar, sailed steadily when the first mate spotted something unusual. A ship, completely alone and adrift. The vessel, a small brigantine, like their own, rocked at an unnatural angle, sails loose and flapping like forgotten rags. There was no distress signals, no response, just silence. Captain David Morehouse ordered his men to approach. As they neared, the name painted on the stern came into view: Mary Celeste. Morehouse's stomach tightened. He knew this ship. It had left New York weeks earlier, bound for Italy with an experienced crew. Yet here it was, abandoned in the open sea. Morehouse's crew braced themselves. Were they about to uncover a brutal mutiny, a pirate raid, or something worse? As they climbed aboard, an eerie stillness hung over the ship. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, and the cabin doors hung ajar, cargo untouched, with food stocked, and a half-written logbook still open. The Mary Celeste was completely seaworthy, yet for some unknown reason, completely empty. If the crew had abandoned ship, why? Where had they gone? And this is where the mystery begins. One of the most fascinating unsolved cases I've come across. You don't want to miss this, so let's dive into it. To understand the mystery of the Mary Celeste, we need to look at who was aboard and where they were headed. The ship had set sail from New York on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, a flammable cargo, but nothing unusual for the time. Captain Benjamin Briggs, a well-respected sailor, commanded the voyage. He brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia along for the journey. An unusual choice, but one that suggested confidence in the trip ahead. The crew was small but experienced. There was no history of mutiny and no reason to suspect any trouble. The weather had been fair, so it seems as if everything was looking good for the Mary Celeste. By November 25th, the Mary Celeste was last recorded near the Azores, about 400 miles east of it. It was sailing smoothly, and only 10 days later, it was found abandoned. There was no signs of a storm, no distress calls, and no indication why they would have left a perfectly good ship behind. Something had to have happened, but what? So let's circle back around to the discovery of the empty ship and look at what might have transpired. Cautiously, the crew stepped aboard the Mary Celeste. The ship rocked gently, the wind slapping at its loose sails, but there was no shouting and no crew rushing to meet them. Only sound was the rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers. They moved carefully across the deck, expecting signs of a disaster, bloodstains, a struggle, anything to explain why the ship was completely empty. Below deck, the cabin doors were hung open, the logbook undisturbed, and the last entry recorded was on November 25th, only 9 days earlier. There was not a single entry in that logbook that hinted at any kind of trouble. All in all, the ship was completely in working order. The ship's cargo of 1,700 barrels completely untouched, except for one eerie detail. The lifeboat was missing. Had something happened to cause the crew of the Mary Celeste to abandon the ship in a panic? If so, why was there no signs? No signs of a fire, no signs of damage to the ship, and no signs of any kind of attack. As they explored the ship more, they would find even more eerie clues. All of the personal belongings of the crew of the Mary Celeste were left behind. Even food that was prepared was left sitting on the table. It was clear that whatever happened, it was unexpected. The ship was seaworthy, the supplies were intact, yet every soul on board was vanished without a trace. Was this a mutiny, a pirate attack, or something supernatural? Well, this mystery gets even deeper, and that's what we're going to get into now. The Mary Celeste was no longer just a ghost ship. It was evidence in a legal mystery. Under maritime law, an abandoned but seaworthy vessel was subject to salvage rights, meaning Morehouse's crew could claim a reward for bringing it to port. But if authorities suspected any foul play, they could be accused of piracy or worse. Captain Morehouse and his crew split up. A few men remained aboard the Mary Celeste, sailing the eerily empty ship toward Gibraltar, an exhausting 800-mile journey. When both ships arrived, British authorities immediately seized the Mary Celeste and launched a full-scale investigation. A formal inquest began under the jurisdiction of the Admiralty Court in Gibraltar, led by Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General. Solly Flood was known for being meticulous, but also jumping to conclusions. And from the start, he was suspicious. How could a crew of 10 people vanish without any obvious cause? There were no distress signals, no storm damage, and no reports of piracy. The ship was abandoned, yet in perfect condition. Solly Flood immediately suspected foul play. He began to theorize that Captain Morehouse and his crew could have staged the entire event, murdering the Mary Celeste crew or forcing them overboard in order to collect the salvage reward. As investigators examined the ship, troubling details would emerge. Dark stains on the ship's floorboards and on Captain Briggs' sword, suspected to be blood. Deep cuts on the railing and woodwork, suggesting an axe or a knife had been used. A missing lifeboat, raising the questions that some of the crew may have fled. Or were they forced to leave? To Solly Flood, this confirmed the worst fears. He believed a violent mutiny or murder had taken place, possibly with Morehouse and his crew involved. But then, the case took an unexpected turn. At the time, forensic science was fairly rudimentary, but early tests were conducted to determine whether the stains were blood. Investigators used microscopic examination to check for red blood cells, which weren't found. Heat testing, which would have caused true blood proteins to coagulate, but the stains didn't react as blood should. Chemical tests like using vinegar or ammonia, which would cause the blood to darken, the stains seemed to remain unchanged. The verdict, the stains were not blood. Instead, they were rust and organic discoloration from exposure to the sea and the salty air. Likewise, the cuts on the railing, once thought to be from weapons, were determined to be the result of weathering or routine ship maintenance. With no evidence of violence, the murder theory collapsed. But that only deepened the mystery. If there was no mutiny, no attack, and no obvious disaster, what had driven 10 people into the sea, never to return? So with no proof of foul play, the Admiralty Court had no choice but to grant salvage award to Morehouse and his crew. It ended up being far less than they expected, but it was still a profit. Instead of a large payout, they were awarded 1/6 of the ship's total value, suggesting that they still had some suspicion the crew was involved. Now, the Mary Celeste was eventually released and resold, but its reputation was forever tainted by the mystery surrounding it. With no official answers, theories began to spread. Was it an explosion, a sudden disaster, or something supernatural? The mystery would only seem to deepen. So there's a lot of theories around this case, and that's what I want to jump into next. So stick around for this part. If you guys are enjoying this episode so far, and you're intrigued by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. Also, if you like or dislike this video, let us know. That way, I will know to cover more or less of this type of content. With that, I'll move on. So, one of the first theories that came up is that the cargo on the Mary Celeste may have actually caused the disappearance of the crew. There were 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, but this wasn't drinking alcohol. This was denatured alcohol, deliberately treated with toxic additives to prevent people from drinking it, especially on long sea voyages. Now, unlike regular spirits, denatured alcohol can cause blindness, organ failure, and death if consumed. It was strictly used for industrial purposes and not for human consumption. Despite the additives and its highly toxic nature, it isn't always enough to stop people from drinking denatured alcohol. There's even stories from the US Navy of people creating a concoction known as torpedo juice, and sailors would develop ingenious ways to treat alcohol to separate the compounds in it. But that's not where I'm necessarily going with this theory. There isn't really any suggestion that a bunch of drunk dudes threw everybody overboard. The one thing I want to hone on is the vapors that this alcohol can create during storage. So during the investigation, authorities discovered that 9 of the barrels were actually empty. The first thought was that they could have leaked. And if so, this would have filled the cargo hold with highly flammable vapors. If the crew entered the hold and smelled the overwhelming fumes, they might have panicked, believing the explosion was imminent. But what if they never saw the leak? Some theories suggest that invisible alcohol vapors were building up inside the ship, and they ended up reaching a dangerous level, where a single spark from a lantern, pipe, or even static electricity could have ignited a sudden fireball. experiments have shown that industrial alcohol can ignite explosively without leaving burn marks. The flames would burn fast like a flashover and quickly vanish, essentially scaring the crew into thinking that the ship was about to go up in flames, even if no lasting damage occurred. Imagine the panic as the crew rushes onto the deck, choking on the fumes. Captain Briggs, fearing for his wife and child, orders an emergency evacuation into the lifeboat. The crew cuts loose the lifeboat, expecting to return once the danger passes. Why didn't they return? So one possibility is that they miscalculated the danger, believing that the Mary Celeste was doomed when it wasn't. And once adrift, they may have realized that the lifeboat wasn't fully functional, maybe it was missing oars, or maybe there was injuries, and they were unable to make their way back to the vessel by simply paddling it. Maybe the wind was too strong. It's not exactly easy to approach a large vessel in a small vessel in rough seas. Others speculate that something went horribly wrong in the lifeboat. Maybe it overturned in the panic and chaos. Maybe a sudden storm swallowed them before they even had a chance to return. At the end of the day, no bodies have ever been found, so the mystery endures. But if it wasn't an explosion, a fire, or a scare, what else would have driven 10 people into the sea? The open Atlantic is often considered to be unpredictable, and one of the theories suggests that a massive rogue wave or a sudden waterspout struck the Mary Celeste, completely flooding the deck and forcing the crew into a panic evacuation or just sweeping them overboard. Rogue waves are towering walls of water appearing without warning. They've been known to knock sailors overboard, damage ships, and cause chaos in an instant. If a wave crashed onto the Mary Celeste, the crew may have still feared she was sinking and rushed to the lifeboat, only to realize too late that the ship was still afloat. But again, it goes back to the question I said before, why wouldn't they return? And the only reason I can think of is that they probably drowned during the panic, like something happened with the lifeboat. The lifeboat was not functional. And this theory actually echoes another famous disappearance that I think about a lot, which is the disappearance of the Flandern Isles lighthouse keepers, who completely vanished without a trace, leaving behind signs of violent weather with no definitive explanation, which is often attributed to essentially 3 dudes being swept into sea by a rogue wave. You should check out my video on that. It's truly an eerie mystery. You can click the link if you're interested. So could the Mary Celeste crew have suffered the same fate of just bad luck, being at the wrong place in the wrong time and being either swept out to sea by a rogue wave or panicking at the sight of one and detaching themselves from the main vessel, ultimately leading to their demise? Now, another theory that we talked a little bit about in the start is that there was a mutiny or foul play involved. As we mentioned, there was no clear signs of struggle aboard the Mary Celeste, but some have speculated that a conflict erupted between Captain Briggs and his crew, perhaps over rations, discipline, or even fear of the ship's cargo. Briggs was said to be a strict but fair captain, deeply religious, and not known for cruelty. However, life at sea was harsh, and tensions could have escalated under the right conditions. If the crew feared an alcohol explosion or had disagreements over how to handle a perceived danger, they could have turned against their captain. Some theorists suggest the crew overpowered Briggs, forcing him and his family into the lifeboat before abandoning the ship themselves. But this theory falls apart under scrutiny. There was no blood, no missing cargo, and no sign of a struggle. Piracy also seems unlikely. The Mary Celeste's valuable cargo remained completely untouched, and there was no evidence of an outside attack. If pirates had taken the crew, why leave the ship perfectly intact? Without physical evidence, the mutiny theory remains purely speculation. And with no bodies ever found, there's no way to confirm if the crew actually turned on themselves. If the crew actually turned on itself, or was forced to abandon the ship. But it just keeps going around in circles, right? There's no violence, there's no evidence, like what could have made them flee? Well, this next theory tries to fill in the gaps where human understanding can't explain this. And some would say that Mary Celeste was never meant to reach its destination. From the moment it was found drifting, whispers of a curse spread throughout the maritime world. How could the ship be perfectly intact, fully stocked, yet completely abandoned? No signs of struggle, no clear disaster. It was as if the crew had stepped into the mist and vanished into thin air. Is it possible that something unseen could have taken them? Because long before its infamous voyage, the Mary Celeste had already built a troubled reputation. Originally launched in 1861 as the Amazon, the ship immediately ran into bad luck. Its first captain died unexpectedly before its maiden voyage. Shortly after, the ship ran aground and was nearly destroyed. Over the years, it suffered repeated mishaps, collisions, sudden crew changes, and inexplicable failures at the sea. By the time it was renamed the Mary Celeste, many sailors already grew to believe the ship was cursed. Some even refused to work aboard it, claiming the vessel carried an unseen force of misfortune. Did this streak of bad luck culminate into something truly unexplainable? Was this ship haunted by a curse that sealed its fate for whoever sailed upon it? And sailors, well, they're a superstitious breed, and stories of haunted ships and phantom crews stretch back for centuries. Some believe the Mary Celeste wandered into cursed waters, where something claimed the lives of those aboard. As we know, the sea is vast and unknowable, a place where reality bends and the impossible becomes plausible. Whether it was some kind of sea creature from the deep, like a giant squid, or like with the crew of the Essex, the true story essentially of the Moby Dick, where a whale came out of nowhere and essentially damaged a vessel to the point where everybody had to abandon ship and they end up in lifeboats. But again, with those stories, there was some evidence, and we don't have that in this case. So one of the things that people start to hone on is the connection to the Bermuda Triangle. The path of the Mary Celeste wouldn't have actually taken it through the Bermuda Triangle, it would have sailed north of it. However, as those attached to this theory try to explain that, well, they might have been off course. A lot of people have jumped on to the theory that somehow is attached to the ship's disappearance. For those of you not familiar with the Bermuda Triangle, I'm sure most are, it's a eerie section of the ocean near Bermuda where multiple ships and airplanes have disappeared over the years without any explanation. So, a lot of skeptics, though, dismiss that it could some way be connected to the ship's disappearance and basically label it as what's called sailor's lore, because the ship would have had to be quite off course to find itself in the Bermuda Triangle. And even that, there's no way to prove actually where the ship was, because it was kind of last seen leaving New York. So it was found empty with no witnesses. The point is, we don't know, and people like to fill in the gaps, which I understand. So it doesn't seem, at least in my eyes, that the Bermuda Triangle actually has any connection to this case, but a lot of people will hone on the fact that they think it does. And whether you believe in curses or paranormal forces or something stranger, the Mary Celeste remains one of the most chilling maritime mysteries in history. It seems to me that when you have a boat like this show up and no evidence ends up ever really being found to suggest where the crew went, that also suggests kind of like a perfect storm of events. You know, for no pieces of clothing to ever wash about, for no blood ever to be found, all those things also seem so statistically improbable that I can understand why people lend their mind to the supernatural, because it doesn't start to seem so far-fetched and kind of a perfect storm scenario causing people to vanish into thin air. But the one thing I do think, we're not going to solve this unless somebody somewhere's great-great-grandfather left a journal because they were one of the crew members, had taken off with the intention of leaving their old life behind to go live in a tropical island somewhere. Yeah, I really don't see this being cracked. And for the Mary Celeste itself, it was deployed back out to sea, forever haunted by its past. The ship would sail on, pass between owners, but its name became synonymous with the unexplained. Even today, no single theory explains everything. The lifeboat was missing, but why didn't they return? There were no distress signals, no struggle, yet 10 people vanished without a trace. Was it a terrible mistake or a freak accident? Or something beyond our understanding? We're never going to know. And that's that. I really want to thank you guys for joining in this week, and I will be back again next week with another obscure mystery. Appreciate it, guys. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button or like this video. Thank you.